And now here's our first story called The Sick Snowbird. In early March of 2022, 70-year-old Abigail Norris was feeling good as she walked out of the Newark, New Jersey airport. It was chilly outside, but she didn't mind. She'd just spent 9 weeks at a friend's house in Southern California. Every day had been filled with sunshine and strolls along the beach. It was the most relaxing winter of her life. Even her chronic back pain felt better in the mild weather. For decades, Abigail had suffered joint pain from osteoarthritis, and she also had lower back pain that made it hard to even comfortably sit upright, let alone move around. But considering how well she felt right now, she was starting to think that maybe she should just go to California every winter. 3 months later, Abigail woke up suddenly in the middle of the night with a sharp pain in her stomach. She fumbled for the lamp on her bedside table, flicking on the light just as another stabbing pain hit her. She groaned and curled up into the fetal position until the room started spinning. Then a wave of nausea hit her, and she hurried to the bathroom just in time to lean over the toilet to vomit. And she would vomit into that toilet bowl over and over again until she was coughing up this yellowish-green bile that came from her liver. And every time she felt like she was done throwing up, another wave of nausea would hit and she would throw up again. It was actually Abigail's third vomiting fit in the past few months. She'd gone to the emergency room the last 2 times, but the doctors didn't know what was wrong. Both times, the pain went away on its own and she was discharged. She had no idea what was causing these symptoms. At first, she wondered if maybe this was some awful side effect of a migraine, which are very severe, debilitating headaches. She used to suffer from them all the time, but they never affected her gut or made her this violently ill. And this particular vomiting spell was the worst one so far. More than an hour passed by before Abigail felt certain she was done throwing up. By then, she felt weak and shaky, and the pain in her abdomen was becoming unbearable. Abigail gathered her strength and managed to get herself dressed. She found her purse and staggered out to her car. Even though she feared it would be another waste of time, she knew she had to get to the hospital again. The next morning, Abigail was laying in a hospital bed, vomiting yet again, but this time into a disposable bag. She had been admitted to the hospital, and then an ER doctor had ordered blood and urine tests along with a CT scan of her abdomen. While waiting for the results, he gave her medication for her pain. He also started her on broad-spectrum antibiotics in case she had a bacterial infection. But none of it helped with her stomach cramps and nausea or the vomiting. Abigail could not stop puking even though her stomach was completely empty. She was exhausted and her stomach hurt so badly that when she wasn't throwing up, all she could do was lie in bed with her eyes closed. Just then, Abigail heard someone come into the room, but she felt too weak to open her eyes. A nurse asked her if she wanted more pain medication. Abigail just shook her head and said no. The pain medication they had given her in the emergency room had not helped, so there was no point in taking any more. Besides, Abigail felt like she'd just throw up anything they put in her system, so she'd rather tough it out and let her stomach rest. Later that morning, when Dr. Howard Pinter entered his new patient's room, Abigail's room, he was hit with the stench of fresh vomit. The acid smell lingered in his nose as he approached her. Abigail lay motionless on the bed, her eyes closed. She looked too weak to move. Her face was pale and glistened with sweat. The hair around her face was soaked through and matted to her forehead. It was clear she'd had a long and sleepless night. Dr. Pinter said her name, and he watched as her eyes fluttered weakly, but she didn't say anything. He realized this was likely the closest thing to a hello that she could muster. He asked her if she could tell him where the pain was coming from, but all Abigail could do was make this low moaning noise, as though talking took too much work. So, Dr. Pinter began an exam, and he pressed gently on her abdomen, asking if that made the pain worse. If he could figure out exactly where the pain was coming from, it would help him diagnose her. But Abigail didn't even seem to notice his hands on her, so he just continued to press up and down on her belly, trying to pinpoint the origin of her pain, but she didn't react to anything he was doing. Her entire abdomen was apparently throbbing in pain, but him pressing on her abdomen made no difference to her. Because her pain was so widespread, the doctor knew he could probably rule out conditions like appendicitis or kidney stones, which tend to show up in one specific place. But there was a laundry list of other conditions that could cause abdominal pain like this, and so Dr. Pinter hoped that the true cause would show up either on her CT scan or her lab work. An hour later, Dr. Pinter sat at his desk looking over Abigail's blood test results, as well as images of her abdomen from the CT scans. On these scans, he couldn't see anything that would cause pain throughout the entire region, but something seemed to be wrong with the quality of the images. He looked through her medical records, and he quickly found an explanation. Abigail had had a small device called a nerve stimulator implanted in her abdomen years ago to help treat her chronic migraines. It worked by sending electric pulses to her nervous system to alter the way her brain experienced pain. However, since the device was electronic, the interference from it was reducing the picture quality of our CT scans, which made it hard for Dr. Pinter to pinpoint the cause of Abigail's stomach pain. But the scans were not the only thing that troubled the doctor. There was also her lab results to consider. Her white blood cell count was extremely high, which suggested she was fighting off an infection or inflammation. And the doctor saw yet another problem too. When body tissue does not receive enough oxygen, it begins to die and releases an acid into the bloodstream. Abigail had a rising level of this acid in her system, which meant that some of her tissue could already be dying. Dr. Pinter worried that she might have a condition called ischemia, which occurs when the supply of blood to the organs is cut off. This condition can lead to a heart attack or stroke. Unfortunately, the CT images were not good enough to identify any blockage in the blood supply that could be causing ischemia. However, Dr. Pinter knew he had no time to lose. He grabbed his phone and called down to the cardiology department and scheduled Abigail for emergency surgery later that afternoon. He needed a vascular surgeon to literally open up her abdomen and look to see if something was blocking her circulation and also to remove any dying tissue. A few hours later, Dr. Pinter received a call from the surgeon who had performed Abigail's procedure. The good news was that Abigail came through the surgery just fine. Her organs looked perfectly healthy and her blood vessels were functioning properly. She did not have ischemia. In fact, it looked like there was nothing wrong with her arteries at all. Dr. Pinter was glad to hear that Abigail looked healthy, but in reality, she was still very sick with something. And now he had no idea what could be causing these stomach cramps, the high white blood cell count, and the rising level of acid in her body. What he really needed was to get Abigail strong enough so she could speak. That way she could answer questions about her pain and her previous vomiting spells. Without her talking, he feared they'd never get to the bottom of her issue. Three days later, around lunchtime, Abigail was eating some Jell-O in her hospital bed. Until this point, she'd been getting her nutrients through an IV. This was the first true meal she'd had since she arrived at the hospital, and if it were up to her, it was going to be the last. She just wanted to go home. That morning, the pain in her abdomen had finally subsided. She'd stopped vomiting and could now keep fluids down. For the first time in days, she actually felt hungry. It was like her illness had disappeared. And her updated lab results seemed to support that idea. Her blood and urine showed no signs of an infection. And so, just like the last two times Abigail had a very serious vomiting and cramping spell, it seemed like everything just sort of went back to normal. The medical staff didn't have an explanation for why she was suddenly better. And so Abigail felt like she was just wasting time and money by staying in the hospital. But a moment later, Dr. Pinter appeared in the doorway, and he told Abigail that he might have an explanation for her pain. Abigail was surprised, but intrigued, and asked him to explain. Dr. Pinter said he had two theories. The first was that she might have a rare nerve condition called abdominal migraines. He explained that when Abigail first arrived at the hospital, he had pressed a hand on her stomach to see where the pain was coming from. That's what made him think that she might be suffering from nerve pain, one of the few types of pain that does not respond to pressure. Plus, Abigail had a history of regular migraines, and he explained that abdominal migraines are related to migraine headaches, but they show up as abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting, rather than the more typical headaches. Dr. Pinter said the other possible theory for what was causing her pain was that she could be suffering from abdominal epilepsy, a very rare type of seizure that causes severe abdominal pain. It's most common in children, but adults can suffer from it as well. And so he asked her if she wouldn't mind staying at the hospital long enough to let the neurology team examine her. Abigail admitted that Dr. Pinter might be onto something, but she just could not spend any more time in the hospital. So she made a deal with him. If he discharged her, she would book an appointment with the neurologist who had been treating her migraines over the past 20 years to see if maybe he thought either of those theories were what was going on with her. Dr. Pinter said they had a deal. The following day, Abigail was home and she sat down at the desk in her bedroom. She logged onto a Zoom call for a meeting with her neurologist, Dr. Randall Bergen. Dr. Bergen was not just a neurologist, he was also a psychiatrist, and he had been Abigail's doctor for over 2 decades, though she hadn't seen him in a long time. When her nerve stimulator was implanted a few years ago, her migraines had cleared up almost completely, so there really hadn't been a need to speak to him. But now, she told him all about her vomiting spells and Dr. Pinter's theories that maybe she had abdominal migraines or seizures. She also told him about her blood tests, CT scans, and exploratory surgery. None of the doctors could find evidence of anything physically wrong with her. And finally, she told him how her pain just suddenly went away after a few days in the hospital. And she said the same thing had happened twice before since coming back from California. Dr. Bergen was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking over all the information. Then, he asked her a question that nobody had thought to ask her before. Dr. Bergen wanted to know if Abigail smoked marijuana. Abigail was surprised. She assured him that she had never smoked marijuana, but she had eaten it. When she was in California, Abigail's friends kept telling her that weed gummies could help with her chronic back and joint pain, and so she'd given it a try. And sure enough, the gummies had really helped. Whenever she ate a gummy, it was so much easier to move and walk around or even just do housework. So, ever since she got home from California, she'd been eating 6 weed gummies a day. When she was in the hospital, she hadn't told Dr. Pinter about the weed gummies because she was embarrassed. Besides, the gummies were supposed to reduce nausea, so she didn't think it was relevant anyways. That's when Dr. Bergen explained that Abigail was suffering from something called cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. It's caused by prolonged use of high-dose cannabis and is characterized by nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. Researchers don't know why some people have this reaction to the chemicals in marijuana, but it's thought that the intolerance could be genetic. The good news was that if Abigail discontinued her use of the weed gummies, her painful vomiting spells would stop. And in fact, that's what was happening each time she was hospitalized. She didn't have access to marijuana gummies, and so after a couple of days, the pain would subside. However, the weed gummies made Abigail's life so much better that at first, she actually really didn't want to stop using them despite the downside. So she tried lessening the dosage and the frequency, but still, she would get violently ill and have stomach pains, and so eventually she did stop taking them altogether. And while her lower back pain and osteoarthritis did come back, she at least stayed out of the hospital and has not experienced pain or nausea since. And now here's our second story called A Spoonful of Sugar. On a warm spring afternoon in 2011, a woman named Brooke Scott arrived at her lively real estate office in Massachusetts with a box of warm chocolate chip cookies for her staff. Brooke walked from cubicle to cubicle, handing out cookies and patting people on the back to celebrate a huge sale for that month. But when Brooke arrived at the cubicle belonging to an agent named Kelly Romano, she stopped short. Normally, 52-year-old Kelly had the energy of a woman half her age, constantly chatting with clients and combing through the latest listings. Today, though, Kelly was hunched over in her chair. Her face was pale and slick with sweat, and she stared at the box of cookies in Brooke's arms with glassy eyes. Kelly reached for one of the cookies, but when she stood up, she swayed back and forth before her knees buckled and she sank back into her chair. Brooke just shook her head. She couldn't smell any alcohol in Kelly's breath, but it was clear. Kelly was drunk in the office. Again. Brooke whispered to Kelly that they had talked about these day-drinking episodes several times over the past year, but Kelly insisted she was sober, and Brooke was making a big deal out of nothing. But Brooke had had enough. She told Kelly to take some time off, and then picked up the phone to call her a ride home. The following day, Kelly went out to run errands with her husband Peter. She still didn't feel quite right, but she was sure the time off would help. As they drove through town, her cell phone rang. It was one of her clients, asking her to set up an appointment to go see a house he wanted to buy. Kelly promised she would set it up. However, the moment they hung up, she completely forgot what property they'd been talking about. Kelly felt rattled by this. She never forgot details like that. So she promised herself she would call that client back once she was feeling less fuzzy. An hour later, Kelly and her husband Peter had finished their grocery shopping and were loading their bags back into the car. Peter needed to make some calls, so Kelly hopped in the driver's seat and pulled out of the parking lot. And after a few minutes, Peter put his phone on mute and looked over at her, and with a confused look on his face, asked Kelly where she was going. Kelly looked around and realized she didn't know where she was. Now, she still knew how to drive. She could tell a red light from a green light. But when she tried to remember the way home, she couldn't. She felt like a lost child. At this point, Kelly knew something was definitely wrong. This was not just brain fuzziness. So she pulled the car over, and she and her husband switched spots. And as she slumped into the passenger seat, Peter looked over at her with concern. He asked her if she knew what year it was, or who was the president of the United States. Kelly knew this was a standard way to check someone's cognitive abilities, and she felt a pang of terror as she realized she didn't know the answers to either of Peter's questions. All of a sudden, Kelly could barely focus at all. She felt like her brain was being flicked on and off like a light switch. And then, her mind went completely blank. Suddenly, Kelly opened her eyes back up. She realized she was lying down in her kitchen. She had no idea how she'd gotten there. She looked over and saw Peter crouched next to her, and then she also realized she was surrounded by paramedics. Peter told her she'd been acting strange the entire way home, and when they went to put their groceries away about 15 minutes ago, Kelly had just collapsed, and so Peter had called 911. Kelly nodded, confused, and then just tried not to move while the paramedics checked her vitals. Also, one of them pricked her finger to test her blood sugar levels, and after checking, he told her that her blood sugar was very low, a condition called hypoglycemia that can cause confusion and dizziness. Kelly asked if they were going to take her to the hospital now, but one of the paramedics just shook his head. He said that she should be fine as soon as she got her blood sugar elevated again. So he helped her sit up and then handed her a little package of jelly beans to eat. After a few minutes of eating them, Kelly was feeling better. Before the paramedics left, they told her to always keep some fast-acting carbohydrates like juice or candy on hand for whenever she felt lightheaded or woozy. Even though Kelly was still totally shocked by what had just happened to her, she was grateful to know what was actually wrong with her. This was hypoglycemia. However, she had to figure out why she became hypoglycemic. A few days later, Kelly sat across from her doctor, hoping for a plan or some sort of medicine to keep these episodes from happening to her again. Aside from these episodes being terrifying, she also just couldn't afford for people to think she was drunk all the time. The doctor explained that most likely, her body was making too much insulin, the hormone that regulates the amount of sugar flowing to the cells, especially the brain. Insulin is very important, but too much of it can pull too much sugar out of her bloodstream, robbing cells of their fuel. And so her brain didn't have the energy it needed to help her remember things or talk, and she didn't have the strength to stand up. That's why she was passing out in the middle of the day like she was drunk. But when the doctor looked over her most recent blood test, he was surprised. He told her that her insulin levels were slightly elevated, as if she had just eaten, even though she hadn't. But he told her to just keep an eye on it and keep an emergency stash of jelly beans on hand, just in case her blood sugar plummeted again. More than a year later, Kelly's husband, Peter, paced around his office with his phone to his ear. He was trying to reach Kelly at work, but she wasn't answering her office line. He had left her 4 messages in the past hour, and he was getting worried because she hadn't called him back. He sighed in frustration as his call went to voicemail again, and he left message number 5. Over the past 12 months, Peter had helped Kelly manage her low blood sugar. He stocked the fridge with juice boxes and made sure there were always packs of her favorite candy in her purse. He knew his wife was not happy with the 25 extra pounds she had gained from all the extra sugar, so he made sure they always went for a walk together before work. Peter knew Kelly was doing her best to keep her struggles from her colleagues, and for a while, it had worked. She didn't have any more of those low blood sugar moments when her colleagues thought she was drunk. But lately, Peter had noticed her low blood sugar moments were getting more frequent, and Kelly had to eat more and more sweets to snap out of them. And so that's why he had gotten into the habit of calling her at work every afternoon to check in on her. After still not hearing back from his wife, Peter decided to call the front desk at Kelly's office and ask the receptionist to check on Kelly. The receptionist said she could actually see Kelly right now sitting at her desk, and from the looks of it, It seemed like Kelly was sort of talking to herself. Peter's stomach immediately sank because this sounded like the start of an episode. But the receptionist told him there was a bottle of apple juice on Kelly's desk, and at that, Peter brightened. It sounded like his wife had the situation in hand. As long as she drank the juice, she would be fine. He thanked the receptionist and hung up, feeling a bit relieved, but still wanting to talk to Kelly that night to make sure she really was okay. But when Peter got home that night, he found Kelly stumbling around their kitchen, slurring her words. And so immediately Peter jumped into action. He held a glass of orange juice to her lips, and after a moment, she kind of came back to herself. And once she had recovered, he insisted this had gone on long enough. They both agreed Kelly needed to see a specialist. A week later, Dr. Frank Miller listened as Kelly described her embarrassing episodes and the constant suspicion that she was drunk at work. Dr. Miller was an endocrinologist, which is a doctor who specializes in hormone disorders. Dr. Miller swiveled his chair to the computer screen to take a look at her blood work, and he saw that her blood contained an amount of insulin that was normal for someone who had just eaten. However, Kelly had taken the test on an empty stomach. Dr. Miller double-checked with Kelly, and she insisted that really, she hadn't eaten anything and only had sips of water for the 12 hours before she took this blood test. Dr. Miller looked at the results again. Kelly's pancreas, the organ that makes insulin, was busily doing its job, even though there was no sugar in her body to process. Dr. Miller thought he might know what was wrong with Kelly. He explained that he wanted to run one more test to confirm his suspicions. But this test would involve more than just another vial of blood. The test was called an endoscopic ultrasound. He explained that he would guide a long, flexible tube fitted with a special instrument down her mouth and into her digestive system. He would wind it through her body until it landed near her pancreas. Then he would take a good look and tell her what he found. By the look on Kelly's face, Dr. Miller knew the thought of him snaking a tube through her insides made her uncomfortable. But he assured her she would get through the procedure just fine. And she would. When she awoke from the procedure, Dr. Miller was happy to report that he'd located the reason for her last few years of misery. The endoscopic ultrasound showed a blob the size of a pencil eraser on Kelly's pancreas. This blob was a benign tumor called an insulinoma, which was made of cells that produce insulin. Normally, the body tightly controls how much insulin the pancreas makes. But the cells in this tumor pumped out insulin constantly, whether the body needed it or not. And so all that extra insulin kept her blood sugar low, no matter how much sugar she consumed. In 2013, the tumor was successfully removed. Kelly's life went back to normal. She stopped needing to eat so many sweets, she was able to lose the extra weight she'd put on, and the rumors of her day drinking were finally put to rest. On November 24, 2011, 23-year-old Victoria Shakte sat in her wheelchair at the dining room table inside of her apartment in Innisfail, Alberta, Canada. On the kitchen table sat a fresh pizza, and then a balloon was tied to the back of one of the chairs. Victoria and her full-time caregiver, Marlene Punenbayan, were celebrating. Marlene, who was originally from the Philippines, had just received her permanent resident status in Canada. This meant that Marlene now was able to receive a range of social benefits provided by the country, and she could now take steps towards becoming an official Canadian citizen. So this was a huge deal for Marlene, and Victoria was just so happy for her. But despite being such good friends and having so much in common and just really getting along, the two women really could not have looked more different. Victoria had dyed red and blonde hair, she had a pierced nose, and she loved wearing really bright colors, in particular red. As for Marlene, she was much more modest. She had dark eyes and dark hair that she always kept perfectly combed, and then even when she wasn't working, she dressed very sensibly. But for anybody who knew these two, Victoria and Marlene seemed like sisters most of the time, and Victoria relied on Marlene more than anybody else in her life. When Victoria was just 16 years old, she had been in this terrible car accident. Her friend, who was driving, was speeding at over 140 miles per hour when they lost control and flipped the car. The accident had left Victoria a quadriplegic, which meant she suffered significant paralysis below her neck.
Now, at the time, Victoria's friends and family were obviously so relieved that Victoria had survived the accident. But, looking at her paralysis, her friends and family were worried that Victoria's life would ever go back to being even close to what it used to be. But even at a young age, Victoria had always been very resilient and put her faith wholly in God. And so through the years of extensive medical treatments, she always stayed positive and strong. And over time, she had actually regained some movement in her arms and hands, and she had sort of built a new life for herself. Now, that life was very different from the one she had growing up, but she still cherished it. And Victoria's life had only gotten better when Marlene had become her caregiver and physiotherapist 3 years earlier. In addition to helping Victoria with her physical therapy, Marlene helped prepare food, she got Victoria ready for the day, and she kept the apartment clean. Marlene also helped look after Victoria's 7-year-old daughter, Destiny. Back at the kitchen table, Marlene and Victoria ate their pizza and talked about how exciting it was that Marlene was now one step closer to becoming a Canadian citizen. After they finished eating, Marlene got up and began to clean the kitchen, and Victoria wheeled herself down the hall to her daughter's room. Destiny's door was cracked open, and Victoria could see her daughter sleeping soundly. Victoria smiled. There were times when she looked at her daughter and just felt like bursting out into tears of joy because she believed her daughter really was a miracle. When Victoria had gotten into that car accident, she was 4 months pregnant. Victoria had been pinned in the wrecked car for 45 minutes before EMTs could get to her, and by the time she was taken to the hospital, she feared she had lost the baby. But 5 months later, her daughter had been born happy and healthy. Victoria chose the name Destiny because she felt like it had been her destiny to have this little girl. Then, years later, Victoria and her daughter had moved to the small town of Innisfail, which is said to get its name from an Irish word that meant Isle of Destiny. So, watching her daughter sleep soundly that night, Victoria felt like, everything that had happened in her life, including the accident that paralyzed her, had happened for a reason, and that she was meant to be exactly where she was right now with Destiny and with Marlene. Later in the evening, Victoria was starting to feel worn out, so she asked Marlene for some help. Victoria said she needed to make an important phone call. So Marlene pushed her down the hall to a small home office, and then she left. That way Victoria could have some privacy on her call. Then Victoria called her financial advisor, Brian Malley. Brian had been a friend of the family for years. He ran a successful construction business, and he had played a huge role in making Victoria's ground floor apartment more wheelchair accessible for her. Brian also owned a small financial firm in town where he worked with locals and people in the area, helping them invest, balance budgets, and manage their money. And managing money had been another major way that Brian had been helping Victoria. Years after her accident, Victoria had sued the person who had been driving the car that hit her, and she had been awarded a settlement of about 575,000 Canadian dollars. With so much money, Victoria had turned to Brian for some guidance, and he had worked to help her make some smart investments and to limit her spending. Brian answered the phone, and for a few minutes, he and Victoria just caught up on what was going on in their lives. Victoria told him the good news about Marlene becoming a permanent resident, and Brian told Victoria that he was excited because he was making the 2-hour drive to Edmonton for business, and so his wife could go to the opera. After a few minutes of this, Victoria finally brought up the reason that she had actually called. She needed Brian to move several $1,000s from her investment account into her checking account to cover her rent and bills and things like that. Victoria immediately heard Brian exhale sort of frustratedly. He told her he was getting concerned about her spending and that her investment account had really begun to dwindle significantly over the past year. Brian tried not to sound too harsh, but he told Victoria that he really couldn't understand why she wasn't sticking to the budget they had laid out for her. Victoria fell silent for a second, and then in a very quiet voice, she said to Brian that the reason she needed more money was to help her family. Brian said he totally understood how important taking care of family was to Victoria, but he said, you're one of 5 kids and you're giving too much money to your siblings. Now, even though Brian did not specifically say this, Victoria knew what Brian was really saying was there was one sibling in particular that Victoria was helping that Brian did not agree with, and that was one of her brothers. The young man had a very serious history of drug use, and Brian was very sure he was just throwing away the money Victoria was giving him to feed his drug addiction. But ultimately, Brian knew it was Victoria's decision what she did with her money, and so Brian said he would call his office and see what he could do about moving the money. But he urged Victoria to really think hard about whether it was worth giving away all this money. After Victoria hung up, she found herself thinking about her family. After she had gotten that court settlement, her first instinct was to use that money to better the lives of everybody in her family, and she had done that, and she was really happy about it. And so even though she knew Brian was making a good point that maybe it was not the best decision to give all her money away to her siblings, she just felt like she had to. And in fact, she couldn't even imagine not helping her siblings or her family out at this point. In particular, her brother who was struggling with drugs. In fact, Victoria believed her kind of red flag brother deserved the most help out of anybody because of his drug use. A couple of minutes later, Victoria called out to Marlene and asked her to come into the study. When she did, Marlene took Victoria and wheeled her to Victoria's bedroom. There, Marlene massaged Victoria's legs like she did every night, and then she helped her get ready for bed. They talked through their plan for the following day. Destiny had to be at school early, and then Victoria wanted to go see her stepfather. Then after that, they said goodnight to each other, and then Marlene stepped out of the room. For a little while, Victoria just lay awake in bed, feeling more stressed out than usual. And the reason she was stressed was about her money. She was thinking about what Brian said and whether or not it was a good idea to be giving all her money to her siblings and her family. And Victoria, she hated thinking about money. It really stressed her out to begin with. But she also told herself that she was going to see her stepfather the following day, and he always had great advice for her. And so maybe he would have some great financial advice. And so with that in mind, and also Victoria's steadfast belief that, no matter her problems, God had a plan for her, Victoria was able to eventually drift off to sleep. The next morning, so November 25th, 2011, Victoria and Marlene woke up early and made Destiny breakfast and got her off to school. Then, back at the apartment, Marlene helped Victoria get ready to go see her stepfather. But right as they were about to leave, there was a knock at the front door. Marlene walked across the living room and opened the door, but there was nobody there. She looked out into the street, but didn't see anybody walking off. Then Marlene looked down at the porch, and she saw there was this large, shiny green and gold gift bag that had no tag on it, and so Marlene just picked it up and stared for a second, wondering who had sent it and who it was for. Marlene walked back inside carrying the gift, and she told Victoria that she didn't think it was a good idea to open it right now because they had no idea where it came from. But Victoria thought Marlene was acting paranoid. To Victoria, this gift was clearly just an early Christmas present. Marlene disagreed and even suggested they should call the police. Victoria rolled her eyes and said that was a huge overreaction, but she could tell Marlene felt really uncomfortable about this gift, so Victoria promised she would not open it up. Marlene put the gift in the kitchen, and then she and Victoria left and went to go see Victoria's stepfather, who lived only a few minutes away. When they got there, Victoria's stepfather greeted the two women with a huge smile on his face, and he welcomed them into his home. A few minutes after they got there, Marlene helped Victoria to the shower. Victoria's stepfather's shower was actually much more accessible than her own, and so Victoria really enjoyed using it anytime she visited. But the shower also gave her an excuse to catch up with her stepfather. The two had been very close since he came into Victoria's life when she was a young girl, and she often turned to him for advice. So, after her shower, Victoria told her stepfather about the money issues she was having that she spoke to her financial advisor, Brian, about the day before. And just like Brian, Victoria's stepfather was also pretty visibly concerned about the fact that Victoria's money was dwindling so quickly. He told her that it was noble that she liked to help everybody she loved, but she needed to remember that that money was hers, and taking care of herself and her daughter should really be her priority, not everybody else. They talked a while longer, and then eventually Victoria asked him if he knew anything about the early Christmas present that had just shown up on her doorstep. At this point, Marlene jumped into the conversation and told Victoria's stepfather that there hadn't been a card or a tag or anything on this present, and she hadn't seen who had left it at the door. And then Marlene said, I told Victoria that we should not only not open this gift, but we should also call the police and let them handle it. And as Victoria's stepfather listened to this, he too started feeling pretty paranoid about this gift. And he told Victoria that, you should call the police and definitely do not open that bag. You don't know what it is. Victoria couldn't believe what she was hearing. Why was everybody so worried about this early Christmas present? Come on. But at the same time, Victoria did not want to upset people, so she told her stepfather that she would not open the gift. A little bit later, Victoria thanked her stepfather for having them over, she told him she loved him, and then she and Marlene headed home. They got back to the apartment just before 9 a.m. Marlene walked right to the kitchen and began washing dishes from breakfast. She grabbed a plate off the counter and began running water over it, when suddenly there was this huge bang that echoed through the apartment, and the entire apartment shook, and parts of the ceiling began coming down. And Marlene, she began screaming because she had no idea what was going on. She figured this must be an earthquake, but she didn't know. And so after a second of just pure terror and shock, Marlene turned and ran out of the kitchen and went into the living room yelling out for Victoria, because again, she has no idea what's going on here. But when Marlene saw Victoria, she was slumped forward in her wheelchair and blood was pouring out of her neck. And so Marlene just ran through all the dust and the smoke in the room and went out the front door and just started screaming for help at the top of her lungs. A neighbor who lived not far from Victoria's small apartment building had come out of his house after hearing that very loud noise. And now he looked up the street and he saw Marlene screaming for help. And so the neighbor immediately grabbed his phone, dialed 911, and ran to Marlene. And when he reached Marlene, he could see very clearly that she had cuts on her body and she was bleeding. But Marlene kept saying, "Somebody needs to go inside. Victoria needs help." And the neighbor happened to be a former volunteer firefighter, so he ran into the apartment without hesitation. Once he was inside, there was all this dust and smoke in the air, and it really made it hard to breathe, and he began to cough. But eventually, after walking through the haze, he saw Victoria in her wheelchair, and so he rushed over to her, and he saw she wasn't moving, and so he reached down to check for a pulse or any sign of life. But after a few seconds of just looking at Victoria, it was clear she was already deceased. And so the neighbor ran back out of the house and sat down next to Marlene, who was collapsed on the ground crying, and just took her hand and tried to comfort her as best as he could as they waited for the emergency personnel to arrive. Seconds later, fire trucks, police cruisers, and an ambulance roared through the small town of Innisfail, and they arrived in front of Victoria's apartment just minutes after the neighbor had made that 911 call. First responders helped Marlene and the neighbor off the lawn and then tended to Marlene's cuts. There was no active fire going on inside the apartment, but still, firefighters were the first to go inside. And when they got in there, they quickly identified that clearly an explosion had happened inside of this apartment. And from what they were seeing, the explosion had not been accidental. Someone had set off an incendiary device. And so the firefighters went back outside, and they would contact local, regional, and national authorities about what they had just found inside of the apartment. Not long after those calls, members of the Explosives Disposal Unit arrived. Members of the EDU are national and regional Canadian police officers trained to detect, disarm, and dispose of explosive devices like bombs. Several EDU officers filed out of a truck in front of Victoria's apartment. They wore these huge 90-pound bomb suits made from protective materials like Kevlar, and they had helmets and blast shields that covered their heads and faces. Several of Marlene's neighbors had come out onto their porches to watch, and from their perspective, it almost looked like a group of astronauts had invaded their street. Inside of Victoria's apartment, the explosives unit did a thorough sweep of every room to make sure there was no longer a bomb threat, and they concluded that the apartment was clear, and so it was time now for investigators and forensic analysts to take over. Corporal Kenmore-Deep DeHill of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is Canada's national police force, arrived at Victoria's apartment with several forensic investigators right behind him. DeHill quickly met with the officers who had gotten to the scene first, and they filled him in with information they had taken from Marlene. They told him the woman who had died inside the apartment was Victoria Shakte. She was 23 years old, and she was a quadriplegic. The officers also said that Marlene had told them about some sort of mysterious gift that had been dropped off outside of the apartment earlier that morning without any kind of card or tag on it. DeHill nodded and then scanned the street. The neighbors had now gotten even closer to the scene, trying to figure out what had happened. The officers pushed them back and told them they needed to stay a safe distance away from Victoria's apartment. Amidst this growing crowd, DeHill saw Marlene. She was sitting with first responders with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He could tell she was in shock. DeHill wanted to talk to her, but first he wanted to get a better idea of what he was dealing with. So he thanked the officers he was talking with for their help, and then DeHill stepped inside the apartment. Forensics analysts told him that they had already found pieces of a galvanized steel pipe, traces of gunpowder, and a lantern battery, clear signs of a homemade bomb. DeHill tried to take in the entire scene. Parts of the walls and floors had been ripped apart, pieces of furniture had gaping holes in them, debris were scattered everywhere, and strands of plaster hung down from the ceiling like confetti. But the real horror was where Victoria was, in the dining room. DeHill walked into the dining room and approached Victoria. She was sitting in her wheelchair with her head slumped forward. DeHill saw multiple serious wounds on Victoria's neck, as well as bloodstains on her skin and all over her torn clothes. DeHill didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but he had been a member of the Major Crimes Unit for years, and he knew that homicides involving pipe bombs like this were often connected to drug gangs. But that just didn't make sense to DeHill. The victim was a young woman who was paralyzed and who had no criminal history at all. Why would she be mixed up with a drug gang? Corporal DeHill made his way down the hall to the bedrooms. He looked into Destiny's bedroom, and all he could think was how glad he was that Victoria's little girl had been at school when this happened. Minutes later, someone shouted for DeHill out in the dining room. So DeHill stopped what he was doing, and he walked down the hall to the dining room, and when he got there, DeHill saw a forensics officer crouched down, staring at something on the ground. She was staring at something that she just uncovered from the dust and the pieces of the ceiling that had fallen to the floor, and she could not believe what she was looking at. DeHill knelt down beside her, and he looked at what she was staring at, and what he saw was a piece of paper with Victoria's name written on it in colored ink. Marlene had previously told the officers that this Christmas present they received did not have a tag on it, but this piece of paper definitely looked like a tag that would go on a gift, at least to DeHill. The forensics officer told DeHill that finding a scrap of paper like this fully intact after an explosion was almost unheard of. And that little piece of paper gave DeHill a jolt of energy, because it could possibly offer a handwriting sample of the bomber. And even more importantly, potentially there could be the bomber's DNA on the paper. So the forensics team bagged up the piece of paper for testing and then continued looking for evidence all throughout the apartment. Later that day, DeHill finally stepped outside of the apartment, and the fresh air felt like it might knock him over. He hadn't realized how difficult it was to breathe inside of the apartment. DeHill caught his breath and then noticed Marlene standing by the road with several officers. The wounds that Marlene had suffered during the explosion wound up being quite minor, so she was able to answer any questions that the officers had. And so DeHill saw this as his chance, and so he walked over to her and introduced himself. Marlene wiped away the tears from her face, and then she told DeHill that she had warned Victoria not to open that gift. And so when DeHill heard this, he followed up with, "Well, Marlene, why were you so worried about this gift? Did you think somebody was planning to attack Victoria?" But Marlene would say, in response to this, that her suspicion about the present had nothing to do with fear that somebody was out to hurt Victoria. She just didn't trust the fact that this present had been dropped off completely randomly a month before the holidays with no tags on it, nothing. It just seemed like something was off about this gift. And then after that, Marlene just sort of broke down. She told DeHill that people loved Victoria and looked to her as an inspiration. Victoria had endured so much for someone so young, but she never let anything stop her. In fact, Victoria often went out of her way to help other people who needed it, whether it was by giving money to her family or volunteering at her church. She was just a very thoughtful person. DeHill told Marlene how sorry he was for her loss and for what she had been through that morning with the explosion. DeHill knew Marlene was physically okay, but he was sure she would never get over what had happened. Then he thanked her for her time and walked back towards the apartment. And as he was on his way, one thing Marlene had said to DeHill really stood out to him, that Victoria apparently gave money to her family. Money, family, and murder often went hand in hand, so DeHill instructed members of his team to begin looking into Victoria's financial situation, and he asked others to track down members of her family for questioning. DeHill still had not formed any serious theories or opinions about who could have delivered this pipe bomb, but he thought maybe in this case, a family dispute over money that maybe erupted into violence might make more sense than a drug gang putting out a hit on somebody like Victoria. So DeHill just needed to figure out who all Victoria was giving money to and who would have benefited from her death. On the night of Victoria's murder, and during the following day, Corporal DeHill and members of his team had contacted and took statements from Victoria's family and friends, and they all basically said the same thing. They loved Victoria. She was a beautiful person and an amazing mother, and they couldn't imagine who would want to hurt her. And Victoria's family were very upfront about the financial aid she had given them all since she'd received her court settlement. But they all insisted that they never wanted to feel like a burden to Victoria and that she helped them because it was something she wanted to do. Now, despite how honest the family and friends seemed to DeHill, he couldn't actually just rule them out because they seemed like good people. The reality was they still needed more information to get to the bottom of Victoria's financial situation to see if that played a role in whatever happened to her. And in conversations with family and friends, DeHill had learned that Victoria had a financial advisor, Brian Malley, who would obviously have a much fuller picture of Victoria's finances. And so DeHill reached out to Brian and asked him to come meet him at a nearby police station. Brian was a 55-year-old guy who was quite tall and had graying hair. He was known for being very polite and outgoing, traits that had really helped him grow his business. Brian told DeHill that he'd actually been a friend of Victoria's family for years, and he had really gotten to know Victoria when he did construction work on her apartment to make it more wheelchair accessible. He also said when he and Victoria began working together on her finances, that also really brought them together, so they were legitimately good friends. DeHill asked him about his investment strategy for Victoria, and Brian would say, the strategy was very standard. His goal was just to add to the money that Victoria already had. That way her and her daughter could be taken care of in the future. And then he also asked Brian if he could think of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Victoria. And when he asked that question, it was the first time Brian seemed to hesitate. And for a second, DeHill actually thought maybe Brian just didn't hear the question, and he was about to ask it again, but then Brian shook his head and broke the silence and said he just could not imagine anybody wanting to do this to Victoria. It just really didn't make sense. DeHill would ask Brian a few more questions, and Brian would do his best to answer, and then eventually DeHill thanked Brian for coming in, and Brian got up to leave. But even before Brian made it out the door, DeHill found himself thinking how strange it was that Brian had hesitated when he was asked, is there anybody out there that you think might want to hurt Victoria? Everybody else who DeHill had asked that question to, family, friends, witnesses, had all pretty much immediately said, no, there's no one. Nobody would want to hurt her. Or certainly I don't know anybody who would want to hurt her. And Brian had basically had the same answer, but again, he had hesitated. And so it could have just been, a brain fart or he zoned out or something, or maybe there was something more to the hesitation. And so DeHill decided he was going to get to the bottom of it. And DeHill did not need to wait long to get his answer, because the following day, Brian contacted DeHill, and what he said cast Victoria's murder in a whole new light. Brian told DeHill that one of Victoria's brothers, who she gave money to all the time, had a very serious drug problem. He'd been addicted to crack for years. But that wasn't all. Brian also thought there was a real chance that Victoria's brother was a drug dealer and that he had gotten on the wrong side of some pretty serious drug gangs. And so by the time DeHill hung up with Brian, he felt like he had just caught his first major break in this case. One of DeHill's initial thoughts about the crime scene was that the type of homemade bomb used to kill Victoria was often used by people in the drug trade. So DeHill wondered if it was possible that Victoria's brother owed money to drug dealers or had encroached on their territory when dealing drugs on his own or something. And if that was the case, maybe those drug dealers killed Victoria to send a message to her brother. And so soon after this call with Brian, DeHill raced off to go speak with Victoria's brother. And when he did and actually began talking to him, the young man tried to be as helpful as he could, and he admitted openly to struggling with drugs in the past. But he said he never dealt drugs to anyone, and the idea that he had connections to major drug gangs was laughable. DeHill was not ready to just take this guy at his word, but one thing DeHill definitely noticed was Victoria's brother was visibly angry that somebody even suggested that he had something to do with his sister's death. He told DeHill he loved Victoria, probably more than he'd loved anybody else in the world. And so after this meeting ended, DeHill did not think he had just gotten any closer to solving the case. However, at the same time, he wasn't ready to just drop the possible connection between drugs and Victoria's murder. And so for now at least, that was still the best lead he had. On December 3rd, 2011, so a week after Victoria's murder, 250 people gathered at a funeral home to say their final goodbyes to Victoria and to celebrate her life. DeHill and other police officers attended the funeral as well. It's common for investigators to go to funerals of murder victims to see how their friends and family and other potential suspects behave. DeHill listened to the people who were closest to Victoria talk about what an unbelievably amazing person she was, and as he listened to this, he just struggled to understand how someone as wonderful as Victoria ended up with a homemade pipe bomb getting delivered to her house. Now, DeHill had continued to pursue Victoria's brother's possible connection to drug gangs, and in doing that, he had discovered that years earlier, Victoria had made an anonymous call to the police about her neighbors dealing drugs. But DeHill still didn't know if that call had anything to do with her brother, or if somehow the neighbors had figured out who made the anonymous call and then took their revenge on Victoria. But DeHill just could not fathom why any drug dealer would wait years to exact their revenge for a phone call to the cops that didn't really amount to much. A procession of mourners made their way towards Victoria's casket, but DeHill focused on Victoria's young daughter, Destiny. Whoever had done this to Victoria, whether they were connected to the drug trade or not, had robbed this little girl of her mother and robbed her of a safe, happy childhood. Seeing Destiny struggling so hard just to talk about her mother made DeHill so mad. And he was also very frustrated that still he had not honed in on one or two major suspects yet. But still, DeHill tried to stay steady and level-headed. He had plenty of information to work with. He just needed more time to figure out what it all meant. After the funeral, DeHill returned to the station and met with his team. He decided this case could very well hinge on the old adage, follow the money. If they could track where Victoria's money went after she gave it to her brother, it could lead them to the person or people they were looking for. So, for the next several weeks, investigators looked into Victoria's financial transactions dating back to when she had received her court settlement. And investigators were able to follow a paper trail of where and when Victoria's money moved. And something they found set off a major alarm. Finally, DeHill had a full picture of what Victoria had done with her money, and he was almost positive he now knew who had killed her. DeHill wanted to act fast, but he also wanted his case to be airtight if it went to trial. So he needed a key piece of evidence that he still lacked. Forensics investigators had managed to pull DNA samples from that piece of paper with Victoria's name on it that had somehow survived the explosion. So now, DeHill just had to secure a DNA sample from his newly discovered suspect to see if the DNA matched. Almost 6 months after Victoria's murder, 2 investigators trailed their suspect from an unmarked car. The Major Crimes Unit had secured a warrant that allowed them to conduct surveillance on DeHill's new primary suspect. The surveillance process had been very in-depth, and it had taken a lot of time, but it convinced DeHill even further that he was right about who had murdered Victoria. So now, these 2 investigators who were following this suspect needed to secure a DNA sample from this suspect to back up DeHill's theory. Eventually, the investigators saw the suspect turn off the street and pull into the parking lot of a fast food restaurant. The investigators could not believe their luck. This was the perfect place to get a DNA sample. From inside their unmarked car out in the parking lot, the investigators watched the suspect get out of their car and walk inside the restaurant. The investigators waited a minute, and then they too got out of their car, and they went inside as well. The investigators bought food just to blend in, and then took a seat in a booth towards the back, and kept an eye on their suspect. Eventually, the suspect finished their meal, threw their trash into the trash can, and walked outside. And at this point, the investigators sprung into action. They put gloves on their hands, walked over to the trash can, and began fishing around inside of it until they pulled out a napkin the suspect had used to wipe their hands and mouth, and they slipped that napkin into a paper bag. And soon after that, the napkin was sent off for DNA testing. It took a while for the results to come back, but when they did, they showed DeHill exactly what he had been looking for. They were a match. DeHill had found Victoria's murderer. Based on DNA test results, evidence found at the crime scene, and police interviews, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on November 25th, 2011, the morning that somebody murdered Victoria Shakte. The sun wouldn't rise for hours, but the killer was already hard at work. They sat at a wooden table staring at their creation. They had spent months collecting the necessary items to complete the project, and now they were finally ready to finish it and put it to use. The killer took a big breath in and exhaled slowly through their mouth. They told themselves that staying calm was key. Shaky hands or sudden movements could be very dangerous. The killer slowly put the finishing touches on the pipe bomb, then backed away from the table and let out a huge breath and felt their shoulders relax. They reached down and picked up a white cardboard box off the floor, and they carefully set the bomb inside of the box. They closed the box and then grabbed a piece of paper and a colored pen, and they wrote the word Victoria in large, festive-looking letters on the paper and then taped it to the top of the cardboard box. Finally, the killer picked up a large green and gold gift bag and placed the box inside. A few minutes later, the killer drove through Innisfail and arrived on Victoria's street. They drove a little ways past her apartment and then parked their car. Then, after pulling their dark cap down to cover their face, the killer stepped out of the car and looked up and down the street. It was empty. So they reached into the passenger seat and took the heavy gift bag containing the bomb, and they walked carefully towards Victoria's apartment. As they moved, they did their best to stay in the shadows and avoid the streetlights. Finally, the killer reached Victoria's apartment, and they placed the gift bag down right in front of the front door, and then the killer knocked on the door and then turned and ran away as fast as they could. By the time Marlene opened the door, the killer was already gone. Hours later, at around 9 a.m., Victoria and Marlene returned from Victoria's stepfather's house, and right away, Marlene headed to the kitchen to do the dishes. But while she was at the sink, she didn't hear or see Victoria, who wheeled herself into the kitchen as well, and Victoria grabbed the gift bag off the kitchen table where Marlene had left it, she put it on her lap, and then wheeled herself into the dining room. Victoria opened up the bag and saw there was a white cardboard box inside. She took the box out and let the bag fall to the floor. And when this happened, Victoria very likely saw that there was a tag on this box. There was that piece of paper that said Victoria in colorful ink. And so for Victoria, this very likely confirmed in her head that Marlene and her stepfather were overreacting about this box. Clearly, this was just an early Christmas present for Victoria, and it was no big deal. And so Victoria ultimately opened up the box. And when she did, the box exploded. And by the time the explosion actually happened, the killer had already arrived in Edmonton, where he had business to conduct, and where his wife was going to see the opera. Brian Malley, Victoria's family friend and her financial advisor, was her killer. It would turn out the image of a kind, outgoing, successful businessman that Brian showed the world was nothing more than an act that he had spent years cultivating. In reality, Brian was a former cop who had been kicked off the Edmonton police force about 3 years after he had joined. Brian's first wife had divorced him because she believed he was a physical threat to her and their daughter, and his second wife had also divorced him because Brian was having an affair with a coworker. But somehow, Brian had managed to hide all of that, and he sort of reinvented himself when he had moved to the small town of Innisfail. And soon he had established himself as a reliable construction worker, and then later as an honest and trustworthy financial advisor. But the truth was, Brian never really changed, and he made a habit out of using his clients' money for his own gain, making risky and even illegal investments in the hope that he could make some big money on commissions. And he got away with it for a while. But in 2011, Victoria had started to wonder why her large investment account kept dwindling so quickly. When she had asked Brian about it, he just kept saying the problem was that Victoria gave too much of her money away to her family. But when Victoria continued to push him for more information about what was happening, Brian started to panic. Because he had actually invested over 90% of Victoria's money in a single, very high-risk stock. And that stock had just cratered, so almost all of Victoria's money was now gone. And Brian had never consulted Victoria about doing this investment, so she had no idea what had even happened. He also obviously never disclosed the inherent risk of putting so much money into a single stock. Basically, you can lose everything really quickly. Brian knew his actions violated multiple Canadian financial laws, so he decided the only way to avoid getting caught and going to jail was to kill Victoria and pin the murder on her own brother. Now, Victoria's brother had nothing to do with the murder, and it was never shown that he had ever dealt drugs. But ultimately, it was the investigators' initial pursuit of the brother's possible drug connection to this crime that had led DeHill and his team to uncover Brian's financial crimes. But even with all of this information about his financial crimes, DeHill needed something much more concrete to directly connect Brian to the murder. Luckily, that piece of paper Brian had written Victoria on and then taped to the bomb survived the blast, and DNA samples from that paper ended up matching the DNA sample taken from the napkin that Brian had thrown away when he was at the fast food restaurant. And so after finding that match, DeHill and his team moved in and arrested Brian. Brian was ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder and several charges related to constructing and delivering an explosive device. He was sentenced to life in prison with a chance for parole after 25 years.
A flash of blue and gold, the stories we are told, but look beyond the street. The rhythm starts to meet a million miles away. Defining yesterday, are we just dust in motion, caught in the ocean? No hands upon the dial, we've got more than a while. Silence isn't empty, it's just pulling us toward the 23rd degree. Forget the ticking sound, look up at the ground we're standing on. Oh, we're riding the stardust on the next. City lights are breathing slow, footsteps fade where we used to go. Your hand in mine, the cold still stays, but love survives in quiet ways. Every crack in the street we cross holds a trace of what we've lost. Feathers on concrete, we still fall, soft in a world that feels too tall. Even when the
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one.